All right, welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. It is the legislative session, and so there are lots of things going on that we will be talking about today. We are doing something new today, which is that we are having Washington Policy on the Go live. So if you want to join us in person in the future, we will let you know. Sometimes we have chairs here with places for an audience, and so if you want to come down and chat with us, and ask questions, we welcome you to do so. If you are online, you can also ask questions, as we always do. So we will be taking the opportunity to see what's on your mind and answer your questions. So today I want to talk about a couple of things. With me is our new education director, Vicki Murray, and there's a lot going on in education this year. The superintendent of public instruction, Chris Reichdahl, is asking for billions of dollars in new funding. So I'm sure we'll talk about that, as well as school choice school choice week is coming up. So we'll talk about that. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in the legislature this week. If you haven't seen, every week I do an update on Monday, talking about the bills that are before the legislature and some of the key ones, not everything, certainly. There's a lot going on to do that highlight. So look for that video each Monday. This week, a couple of things that I highlighted is one, a bill that we have worked on quite a bit relating to salmon recovery and creating what's called a salmon recovery accelerator. So Washington State spends hundreds of millions of dollars to improve habitat and do other things to improve salmon populations. Because we like salmon, because orca like salmon and are starving, but also we want more salmon to fulfill treaty obligations to tribes and then also to provide for commercial and sport fishermen. And so we want to make sure that every dollar that we spend on salmon recovery is having that impact. Too often, though, the state shoots itself in the foot. We spend money on salmon recovery, on projects. We say, okay, go do the project. And then the projects get wrapped up in bureaucratic red tape. There's no reason that that should happen. We shouldn't have government fighting against government projects. So what we have proposed is what we call the Salmon Recovery Accelerator. It will be heard in the Senate Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee this Thursday. Has some very nice bipartisan support. And what the accelerator allows is the creation of what's called a regulatory sandbox. Sandbox been started in a number of more than 30 other states in a variety of different areas. This would be the first one on environment, and allows projects and organizations who are running into regulatory barriers to highlight those regulatory barriers and go to the agencies and say, are there ways that we can waive, eliminate, or change these so that we can do the work that we're supposed to do? It would work through the Office of Regulatory Innovation and Assistance that's already part of the state. And so the cost of doing this would be very little. But what it would do is that it would tell agencies, look, don't use your regulatory authority to slow things down. Use your discretion to speed things up. So we're very excited about that piece of legislation. It's a good example of how removing government and regulatory barriers is the way to accelerate environmental restoration, not more government programs. So that's one thing. The other thing I'll mention is that every week I try to look for my favorite bill of the week. This week, my favorite bill is from Representative Mary Dye, who has a bill that would waive taxes for wineries that produce less than 20,000 gallons of wine a year. So I am all in favor of innovation in winemaking in Washington State. And so that bill is also getting a hearing this week. So before we move on and talk with Vicki a little bit about education, one of the things that I wanted to do is to sort of level set. The number one issue that you are going to hear about this legislative session is the fact that there is a shortfall between what government wants to spend and the revenue that it has. You will hear numbers ranging from the gap over the next 4 years is between 10 billion, 12 billion. I've even seen $16 billion. And I want to make sure that we understand a couple of things about that and what's going on and how and the discussion to close that gap. The first is that that gap is exaggerated. At the very highest end, it is based on Governor Inslee's budget proposal, which massively increases spending far beyond what is appropriate. And so what they have done is pad that baseline quite a bit. You're going to hear a lot of talk about cutting spending. And so what they will do is they'll say, well, we actually ended up having to cut spending, but it's from that very high level. It's sort of like when a company, someplace raises their prices and then calls a sale, right? You're not actually getting a sales price. You're getting a still higher price. They're just calling it a sale. They want to try to do that. And so I think we need to be cognizant about, okay, so what are we actually spending? What are the cuts? What baseline are the cuts from? But before we even get there, it's important to understand that Washington state spending has grown dramatically over the past decade. So when you adjust for inflation and population in Washington state, the state operating budget spending has increased over the last decade 58% more than inflation and population. So that's a huge increase, a lot more than people are seeing in their paychecks, a lot more than people are seeing in their daily lives. That's how much the government is spending. And so the fact that we can increase spending 58% above inflation and population over the past decade and still have a shortfall of 10 or more $billion indicates that the problem is not that a lack of revenue that we're getting. It is a dramatic increase in spending. So before one more thing I wanted to add, which is that the impact that is having on Washington state business. So we are going to be releasing a number of metrics that we call the report card for Washington's future in several different areas so that we have a baseline for how Washington is doing, the problems that have to be faced and addressed. And one of them that is right at the top is business competitiveness. Washington state over the last decade has seen a serious decline in our business competitiveness. And let me just read a few of the statistics here that we'll highlight, which is first that CNBC ranks states by sort of, how good they are to do business. And a number of times you'll see these rankings and Washington state will look very good, but they will look good because they'll say things like, it's a great place to live. We have, very nice outdoor recreation. Our education system is good. But when you actually look at sort of business climate and things that government controls, we do very poorly. For instance, CNBC ranked Washington 42nd in business friendliness and 42nd in cost of living and 39th in the cost of doing business. The census data show that Washington state has by far the highest rate of business failure in their first year at over 40%. The national average is almost half of that. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One of them is our very high taxes. And last, the Tax Foundation, a nonpartisan national organization, which every year ranks states based on tax competitiveness, 10 years ago, in 2014, said that we had the fifth most competitive business tax climate in the country. For 2025, they ranked us the fifth worst. We went from fifth best to fifth worst over the course of a decade. So those are the sorts of things that we're going to be highlighting during this legislative session. The fact that we already have a tremendous amount of revenue and we shouldn't have to increase taxes even more. And second, that increasing taxes above what they already are is going to make it even more difficult for business and innovation to occur in Washington state. So with that as sort of the prelude, talking a little bit about what's going on in the legislature, I want to turn to Vicki. One of the people who is asking for a lot more money is Chris Reichdahl, who is the superintendent of public instruction. He has asked for billions more to improve education. So talk a little bit about what he wants and what your thoughts are.
Well, what should be a surprise to no one is our superintendent would like more money. In fact, nearly $4 billion more. So let's break down what's going on. I think members of the State Board of Education must have seen that CNBC poll because yesterday there was a hearing in the House Education Committee about we're redoing our state standards because out of concern for business competitiveness, future workforce concerns. And if you're having a sense of deja vu, I promise it's not Groundhog Day, because within the past decade, we just implemented Common Core standards, which were supposed to ensure that all children in every state, every grade level were on track to be college or career ready. Now, I'd like to review because it's as though we have no memory. I want to just review how many times we in the states have revised standards. And these are just the big picture ones. These aren't even some targeted things that are happening in local communities. We'll recall that in 1965, we had the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, and that was to pour billions of dollars to help poor children improve educational outcomes. Then in 1979, we reestablished a U.S. Department of Education to improve academic outcomes. Then in 1983, we published A Nation at Risk. You may have heard the phrase, the rising tide of mediocrity. And the report found that if a hostile power had inflicted the poor performance levels on our students, particularly in math and science, that we were experiencing, we would consider it an act of war. Well, flash forward, we had the goals of 2000 that in 1990s, by 2000, we're going to be 100% proficient. And then we had No Child Left Behind. And then we had Common Core. It's exhausting. It's exhausting because every 10 years, we're rejiggering. We've got some new silver bullet, and look at what's actually happening in our schools. We have to rip out what we put in, all the cost, chaos, and confusion. And then we wind up blaming the test about 10 years later, and then here we are. Again, welcome. So let's level set as to where we are in Washington State. Right now, we are spending on average close to $20,000 per student. If you're from another state, these numbers are eye-popping. You could almost get a nice used car for that amount. That's equivalent to a really good in-state college tuition levels. But no, that's what we're spending per pupil. And here are the results, because anyone can spend other people's money. This is not a virtue. We have to check ourselves. Look, I spent more than everybody else. That's not a virtue. That's not our goal. It's about getting more bang for buck. We want that return on investment. When it comes to education, we want to see if student learning has improved. And the way we measure that is through our test scores. Now, on the state test, the Smarter, Balanced, College and Career Ready test, what we know is that the percentage of students who are consistently at grade level in English language arts, 50%, math, 40%, science, 44%. Now, particularly in math and science, we should look at those scores because that's a very good barometer for future workforce development, future state GDP, and economic growth. So if you want to see what our state revenues are going to be, you want to make sure that children are really doing well in math and science, not because they're actually learning, not because there's some tricks or fiddling with the test. Now, let's go into what the State Board of Education is doing. They gave a very interesting presentation in front of the House Education Committee yesterday. And they also had two students. One was, I believe, a senior in high school. One is a recent high school graduate. And it was fascinating what these students said. What their suggestion was to get students more engaged, particularly those who are just not flourishing in school, is they want more student-centered approach, innovative approaches, more personalized approaches to learning. We're going to get to how important parental choice in education is in a moment. But what the state board is doing is talking about doing the new standards. What it isn't doing yet is suggesting what these new standards are. In a nutshell, this is an SBE standards do-over. They're talking about the process and the approach. We don't want to get hung up on these very rigid definitions of standards or excellence or what students should know or be able to do because of school. It's really, my sense was it was a lot of subjective, sort of fuzzy, amorphous language. feel good, but amorphous language. They won't have a proposal. So we're going to be doing listening tours, lots of blue ribbon panels, stakeholders, 40 some odd groups. I don't know if they're representative of all of Washington, but that's what's happening now. They won't have the standards ready for the legislature to consider until 2027. So I would urge everybody to monitor these listening tours, make your voices heard, because I suspect we're going to go away from objective standards and more towards very soft, subjective, feel-good types of things, which don't serve individual students or the state very well. But let's talk about what actually would serve the state well. Starting on January 26th, we're going to have National School Choice Week.
Before we go there, I want to do one more thing to talk
Yes.
about where we are and then talk about sort of solutions.
Yes.
So we talked about the increase in funding for the budget.
Yes.
Superintendent Reichdahl is asking for billions more.
Mhm.
So over the last 10 years, the per capita student spending has increased about 40% above inflation.
Mhm.
So we've increased the per student spendings, as you said, to about $20,000 dramatically, and he wants an increase, even a larger increase during that period of time. What's happened to test scores? How have students done given that very large increase already?
Well, that's the question we all have to ask. What are we getting for our education investment? And here it is. We have spending just for public schools has increased in inflation adjusted terms. And this is from the state itself. This is how the state inflation adjusts. It has gone up nearly 50% from over 15 million to over $33 million. So that's almost a 50% increase. Test scores are actually down a bit. We have alarming majorities of children who are not proficient, and enrollment has been essentially flat. It's gone up, 100,000 students or so. So this is flat. Test scores are a little bit down, but funding is through the roof. The question we need to ask is increased spending on what? Excellent teachers, demonstrated excellent teachers? I don't think that's a problem. It's going to administration and mental health professionals. So we have to start, if we can't even get the basics right, I think we have to stop mission creeping into all these other areas that really the family should be taking care of. We're giving children, everyone gets a free breakfast, free meals. It's not just for low-income families. Everyone's getting mental health, financial services, tax planning, how to rent an apartment, how to do this, how to do that. So this is what education is supposed to do. This is what families and parents are supposed to do. And I think we have to define our mission again.
Yeah. And on national tests,
Mhm.
Washington State students have actually did worse in comparison to other states over the past decade, even as spending has increased.
Yes, and it's very interesting. It's a fascinating to look at the trends, because if you look at the trend lines, the scores on the nation's report card, nationally administered test, those scores are essentially going down. Meanwhile, spending is going up. And it's interesting when you talk about, oh, poor us with the state spending. Washington went from about in the 20th range, sort of middle of the pack in terms of state spending. The U.S. Census Bureau now has Washington State as 5th highest in the country. I think DC is at the top, and that's not our goal. We don't want to beat Washington.
That's per student spending.
Per student spending, state spending.
Yeah.
So
well, it looks like I want to talk about school choice.
Yes.
We have a couple of questions though that I want Donald to read out.
Yeah. So are these stats public school or a blending of private and public?
That's an excellent question, and thank you for that. It's actually public school. So the state tests, that is public school.
And the spending as well.
And the spending, that's only public school spending, yes.
If we increase compensation to teachers and staff, will the student metrics improve? Or should the tests be modified to reflect current capabilities?
I think what we have to do, in terms of testing, I'm going to answer the question backwards. I think we make too much and too little of testing. What do you want students to know how to do? And we tend to focus on Are you ready for post-secondary education, whether that's for your baccalaureate, whether it's the trades? Because I really don't want to skip the trades. That's an often overlooked critical aspect of a thriving society and economy. Or what about if you're going to go to community college, which, let's face it, makes a whole lot of sense, particularly if you're not sure what you want to major in yet. So there's a way to just reverse engineer it. Think of trend lines, or how when we want to chart weather, we do trend lines. We could do the same thing for test scores. Where should students be to achieve here, 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 and reverse engineer what they should know. And that way we could see a student at any grade level at any point in time is either on trend or maybe not quite there. And we should be testing pre and post tests, not so much high stakes, but pre and post tests so parents and educators can get together and intervene. But we should also let children, if you're doing fine in English, move on in English, no matter what your grade level is. You need a little more help in math and science? Okay, wait and move on when ready should be, I think, our theme. I think as in terms of where we give our investments, the number one investment we can make that has shown tangible, statistically significant results is teachers. And it's not just everybody, you get a raise, you get a raise, you get a raise. Teachers who have shown to improve student learning as measured by test scores. So investing in great teachers is a great investment. Just throwing money generally not. That's what we're doing. We're seeing the fruits of that approach.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about school choice. So
Oh.
next week is School Choice Week.
School Choice Week. This has been a national celebration since 2011. And if you see these scarves around, this is, sort of since the inaugural year, National School Choice Week. This celebrates educational options, all types of educational options, whether it's public school choice, from picking your district public school, picking your charter school, homeschool, private school options. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the private school non-public school options that are out there because they're a little less familiar, I think, perhaps in Washington. Right now, we have tax credit scholarships. Imagine being able to, we're very generous people here in Washington. You write a check to your favorite charity. Imagine if you could write a check to a scholarship organization and you could take a dollar for dollar credit off your state income taxes, and a deserving child who maybe is going to a school that isn't serving him or her well, you get a scholarship to go to the private school of your choice. Right now, we have so many of these programs. Over 20 states right now have these programs, and they're educating over 250,000 children nationwide. One of the programs I'm most excited about is education savings accounts. This is the newest innovation in educational freedom and parental choice. And they operate like a health savings account, which, if you've ever heard of have a health savings account, you get a dedicated use debit card, you spend on legitimate health purchases. Well, 15 states now allow parents to do that with their state and local funding. So if a public district or charter school isn't working for children, their parents enroll them in the state education savings account, and they get up 90 or 100% if children have special needs of their state funding follows that child to the parents' chosen school, or parents can do online curriculum, really customize a child's learning to unprecedented levels. And you want to talk about accountability. Try quarterly expense reports. Most of us have done those. We have to get in our expense reports. The state does that, and if there's any misspending, you find out about it weeks from the occurrence, not years later, and you have to pay it back, or you can be prosecuted by the state. And so it's a fiscally responsible program that's working well for students. And by the way, that wonderful innovation and competition is a tide that lifts all boats, and we're seeing program participants do better, as well as the district public schools, the district charter school students. So it's a win-win for everybody, and it really takes innovation to whole new levels.
So talk a little bit more about that, about how students do when they have these opportunities. But then you also mentioned something that I've seen elsewhere, which is that it's not just the students in those charter schools or the schools that they choose, it's all of the schools. including the public schools, that
Yes.
start to do better when there are those sorts of options?
Absolutely. And we started studying this. People might be surprised to know that educational choice is one of the most widely studied and researched aspects of education out there. And thankfully, we have decades now of empirical research. And what happens is, and think about it in our own life. So as we're talking about schools, think of coffee shops. So if the state were running coffee shops and you could only go to one coffee shop and you can only go to the coffee shop in your neighborhood, you probably wouldn't have the hundreds, if not thousands, of permutations of a cup of coffee that we have now, because you can go anywhere and they're all different types of coffee shops, any flavor, any permutation you like. Well, the same thing is happening in education. It's no longer like you can go to any school and everyone's sort of like a factory model. There is now powerful, positive encouragement, incentives to innovate, because you want to make parents happy. When parents can vote with their feet and you free schools and educators to innovate, marvelous things happen. And I think one of the biggest fears for states like Washington, where you don't have these programs, is that, well, I like the idea, it sounds equitable, but I'm afraid of what's going to happen to traditional public schools. Won't there be an exodus? Well, I can tell you, parents don't pull their children out of situations that are working for the children. Only the schools that are not serving children well do you see that happening. And by the way, I know firsthand, I'm from Arizona. When we did this, we had universal public school choice, and then within just a few years, universal private school choice through tax credit scholarship. So parents could go anywhere they wanted. There were no restrictions, all lifted. There was a school that was doing terribly. I believe it was in Tempe, bled students. For the first time in the history of that school, guess what the teachers did? Guess what the administration did? Why did you leave? What can we do? Flash forward a couple of years, that is one of the biggest school districts in the state. It's just growing by leaps and bounds because it listened to parents. That's what happens, but you have to, freedom is the secret sauce.
Yeah.
And that's it. And every education dollar, by the way, your ROI goes through the roof.
And I think there's also something sort of strange about saying, gee, what's going to happen to schools that are doing badly? Well, they should lose students, right? We
Yes.
shouldn't, the argument shouldn't be we need to keep students in failing schools.
No, the problem with not just Washington education, the problem with, I would argue, American education isn't that bad schools close. It's that bad schools stay open. And then we always have these great beat the odds schools that are getting less than everybody else, have more challenging student populations, and they're crushing it. Why should those schools get resources so they could scale? But no, we keep the bad schools. And yes, I'm making a judgment call. There are bad schools, and yes, they should close.
Yeah. So we have a number of questions. Donald, go ahead. Why don't you?
At what point do we stop encouraging fact memorization for testing and get back to explorative, Socratic teaching that gives students the tools to learn and think, and use tests simply to assess those successes along the way?
Well, that's a great question. I'm a huge fan of the Socratic method. That was my approach in graduate school and also in college. However, in order to get to that level, there's certain foundational knowledge. So I personally don't have a problem with children memorizing a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I don't have a problem with children memorizing the sun always rises in the east and sets in the west. There's certain knowledge that we just have to know. And from there, that's the beauty. That's where the exploration of learning can really happen. You've got to equip children. Stop looking at it as boring or we're inflicting a punishment. Those are tools that are going to free children's minds and set them on a great path going forward, for them to explore in ways that they want to, not the system wants them to.
Yeah, and giving them choice and flexibility allows these sorts of things in a way that a standardized curriculum may not.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What's another question?
I'll group these two. Do you have the test scores for private schools and how they compare to public schools? And do you have the cost of private compared to public education? Do you have those numbers?
I'm going to start with the test scores. It's often very tricky to get test scores. For example, on the nation's report card reported publicly, because the population of private school students is so small, there are privacy concerns. But that's something I would like to look into to see if we can get those. As for private schools, what we know nationwide, and this is something I really want to look into after the legislative session, when things calm down a little bit. What we do know is that particularly programs, schools that participate in parental choice programs, they tend to be faith-based, and it's faith-based schools, largely Catholic schools. They're the largest segment of that population. They tend to be about 1/3 to about a half less than district public schools. So they tend to be less. Don't think of the Hollywood versions of the private schools where it's hugely expensive, or boarding school or something. That's not the norm.
So one of the critiques that you hear all the time of charter schools and other school choice is that they will high grade, is that they will take the best students and leave the public schools with the worst students, and then they'll be underfunded to deal with this smaller population of students who have greater needs. What's the experience with that?
Well, that's interesting because that keeps coming up. That's one of those talking points that I wish, opponents would dust off, because that's been around for decades. And it has been disproved time and time again. The vast majority of parental choice programs, at least in the beginning, start out for children who are in failing schools, who are not thriving, have special needs, are in unsafe schools, or from the foster care system, have some sort of challenge. And as you expand, they expand. And you want to know why they expand? Because every child is unique. Every child is special. And so the idea that, and as this happens, guess what the district schools district schools, that's what people are afraid of. They start improving. They do better. They get more innovative. Teachers, by the way, have more freedom to, experiment with their classrooms. So it's actually a win-win. Don't buy the scare tactics. When someone tells you that's going to happen, ask them, really, please give me an example. See what they say.
Seattle Times did it. It's been a while, but they did an article where they were looking at the populations of charter schools in the Seattle area, and what they found is that actually the charter schools were more racially diverse than the public schools at large, and also they had a higher percentage of students with special needs.
Yes.
Which makes sense, because you would think, okay, so where are the parents who are going to be dissatisfied with the public schools and sort of how and the resources that they're being provided for their kids? And they say, look, I need something more. My students need something special. Let me see if there are alternatives.
Yes.
And that's sure enough, that's what the data showed. And actually at one point, we had a charter school that was specifically dedicated to homeless children,
Yes.
right? Kids who move around a lot, who have a lot of challenges.
Yes.
And there was a school dedicated to them. And unfortunately, like so many other charter schools, they ended up getting pressured and didn't have the resources to continue. So those sorts of arguments get made all the time. But when you actually look at the data for charter schools in Washington State, what you see is the opposite. It's the students who need the most support who are the ones who are enrolling.
And that's not just Washington. That we've seen that in every single state where charter schools are allowed. And Washington could be blowing every other state out of the water with the innovation. We're so innovative in every other way. Then breaks on at the schoolhouse door. We have to stop that. That's an artifact of politics, not policy.
All right, we have a couple more questions.
With our new leadership, will charter schools be able to grow? My understanding is that Washington has an allowed amount now, but has not been able to implement them because of restrictions. And what are those?
If you want to lift those restrictions, we have to call our elected officials and demand that those be lifted. There's really no getting around that. The evidence is clear. The empirical data are clear. And let's talk about caps. Like, oh, we're so afraid, they were innovative. We don't want to rush in with this. Charter schools are decades old now. Do you know the idea of a charter school originated in, I believe it was 1970 at Harvard School of Education, called Education by Charter, by, I believe the gentleman was a self-identified socialist. He wanted better working environments for teachers. It used to be embraced by the teachers' unions, but politics swirls and here we are. There's absolutely no good reason. If people want it, we shouldn't cap it. We should blow the lids off of it and allow charter schools to innovate. I come from a state where 20%, almost it's over 20% of our public school students are in public charter schools. And they come in every shape and size, every flavor, every variety you can imagine, back to basics, arts, everything. And if you look, I would invite and encourage you to look at the US News Report, US News and World Report rankings. Arizona charter schools dominate that list, and we have for years, even though we spend thousands less than other states. Charter schools work, and there's no good reason we should not be benefiting from them here fully. Another thing, let other people authorize them, not just the state. Are you in the trades? Are you a business? Authorize a charter school. Are you a university program? Why can't you authorize a charter school? Why can't parents and teachers authorize charter schools? We have to think much bigger and much more innovative ways.
One of the challenges that we've had in Washington is that essentially when you're starting a charter school, you're starting a school district, right? You have to create all sorts of rules and regulations and guidance and other things like that. But charter schools are also at a disadvantage because my understanding is that they don't receive the capital investment. They receive the per student, but they don't receive the capital cost that school districts get. So they are at a disadvantage at finding, places and buildings and other things like that. They don't get the money for that. So, comparing charter schools to public schools and saying, well, nobody wants to start a charter school and things like that, it's because we've hamstrung them.
Yes.
If we put them on a level playing field, giving them the same resources that public schools have, we would see a lot more of this. But obviously, teachers union and others campaigned against it. And so they have slowly put these sorts of restrictions on to make it more difficult.
And there's absolutely no good reason. Sorry, do children who want to go to charter schools, do they no longer have capital needs? Imagine these arguments applied. Think of all the school districts that are running bonds. I mean, we're in bond elections. Imagine if we use the same arguments that we use against charter schools, against district schools, people would be up in arms. Yeah. So I think the more we have to remember that regardless, we have to stop thinking about this school, that school. We don't have these fights at the post-secondary level. We really don't. We have to start focusing, stop fixating on where children are educated and focus on whether they're educated. Let public funding follow children to wherever they go to school and unleash parents. Nobody's going to be the best accountability measure is a empowered, informed parent. That's how we're going to fix things.
I think we got one more question.
How does WPC moving forward in providing the legislature and OSPI solutions that can actually make it past the roadblock of the teachers' unions?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. There are so many, the teachers' union, let's do math. I like to do it this way because people say, oh, we can't because of this, the teachers' union. There's a whole state of people, the number of parents, the number of taxpayers vastly outnumbers the number of union members. Stop using unions as the boogeyman. I know they're powerful. I know they are a voice at the table. They are not the only voice. You want your voice heard, we can send an email. We can call our elected representatives. We can show up at our school board meetings in person or remotely if you can't, because we're working. Yeah. Find out what's going on at your school district ahead of time and send an email ahead of time. We have to be engaged. We can't abdicate. That's it. There's no magic wand. I can't give you a magic wand that's going to say, oh, look, teachers unions are now with us. There are certain things that I think we can work with the teachers union on. Parental choice historically has not been one of them, sadly, because parental choice is just great for kids. It's great for teachers too. So hopefully we can make inroads by using the data, the truth, not using invective and scare tactics. That's something that we eschew. But quite frankly, education is something that we all have a vested interest in, and we have to get engaged, and we'll give you the information you need. Contact us. We're here. That's what we do. So if you need information, please get in touch with us. We'll get you the facts to prepare you to go out and talk to others.
Yeah, and there are always opportunities, odd numbered years. There are school board elections across the state. So if you want to, make a change in your local school district, talk to your school board members, right?
Yes.
I think making those sorts of changes can have a big impact. There's also things going on in the legislature. You're paying attention. You're overwhelmed with lots of things. But I'll just give you an example. The legislature, citizens signed the initiative, the Parents' Bill of Rights initiative, that gave a lot of parental notification. That bill, there was a bill to change that already this year. And just to give you a flavor of that, one of the pieces of the legislation would change notification from if your child was I don't know, assaulted or other things like that, had some crime committed, that what the current initiative said is that they had to be notified immediately. The bill proposed in the legislature would change that to 72 hours. So so a school district could know for 3 days that your child had a crime committed against them and not tell you. That's a bill in the legislature. So those are the sorts of things that people need to pay attention to. So thank you very much, Vicki. Great to talk with you. I know we'll see you a lot more because education is going to be a big issue this session. So I think with that, we actually have audience members. As I said, you can join us here for Policy on the Go, and we have some audience members, and we have a question.
Excellent session on education. Todd, you started by talking about your bill of the week being pro-wine industry.
Yes.
I don't know if you saw that there's a bill that released to eliminate sales tax on prepared food. And I'm just curious, as we look at the minimum wage continuing to go up in affordability, might this help some restaurants and cafes stay in business?
Yeah, so the question, I don't know if you could hear it, but there is a bill proposed that would currently, obviously, food that you buy at the grocery store, you don't have sales tax on it, and so this would extend it to prepared food. The goal, I think, probably being to help restaurants who are laboring under a lot of additional costs, like the increased minimum wage. I think that that's fine, but it doesn't get at the underlying cause of the problem, which is that we're constantly driving costs up for restaurants. People argue about the right level for the minimum wage, but there is an alternative to the minimum wage that is better both for the state and for businesses, and that is what at the federal level is called the Earned Income Tax Credit. So businesses pay for the employees. In many cases, the people who are locked out of jobs are those with the least amount of skills, the people who need the most experience, right? Who don't have that experience to justify a very high minimum wage. What an earned income tax credit does is it allows businesses like restaurants to give those people the experience to get into the workplace so that they can increase their pay over time and get that experience, and then they get a tax credit on top of it. It takes people off of unemployment, it takes people off of welfare and puts them into the workforce, as well as creating a business environment. So that's a better approach. So I appreciate certainly anytime you're cutting taxes and cutting costs, I think that's great. But I think you can't say, okay, this is now a solution to the minimum wage problem, because that's not going to work. That may be great for restaurants, but there are others who are being locked out by very high minimum wages. And again, the answer doesn't have to be, sorry, you're not going to get paid enough. The answer can be, here is a better way with like an earned income tax credit to get that experience, to get that job, so people can earn a living, but at the same time getting the experience they need. We do have one more question online.
Do you have the bill number for the one you were talking about?
I don't. I'll try to look that up. It is at this point that there are about 30 bills introduced a day, and I cannot remember any of the numbers. So, but we'll make sure to post that. Also, if you are not following us on Twitter, all of the Policy Center researchers have good Twitter feeds and update that as well. So that's another source. As we find these sorts of things, we put them out there. So we are at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope that those of you who are in the area next time can join us live. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to answer, and always make sure to visit washingtonpolicy.org for the latest information about what's going on in the legislature. Thanks so much.